The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And, you know, I love when guests come back to my show. It must mean that I'm doing something right. We got Professor Martin Babicz, National Pastime, U.S. History through Baseball. Last time we did baseball up until 1920. The ending of the dead ball era, and today we're going to try to get through the 1920s, the 1930s, the Negro Leagues from about the time of Plessy versus Ferguson. We'll get into what Plessy versus Ferguson meant and what it was, if you don't know what it is. And we're going to try to hit the nail probably up to the end of World War II. If not, we'll get Professor Babicz back to the show. And because the discussions are very important, not only do we talk about baseball, but we talk about the time period and the historical events that encompass the decades by which baseball, was played. And, of course, in the 1920s, you had the Roaring '20s. Things changed. We're going to get into how Babe Ruth became the superstar that saved baseball, and we'll get into that. And what he meant to the age. And, of course, a lot of people consider it the Jazz Age, you know. It was modern times. It wasn't this Victorian times period where, most of it ended at the end of World War I. And now America wanted to go back to normalcy. Women were wearing makeup. They had the right to vote. You had Charles Lindbergh. And we'll get into all that because that's some of the favorite stuff that I love to deal with. But, of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I always have to break for station identification with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And, boy, we have some exciting shows on baseball. We got Vintage Sports with Hal Bach. We got Peter Golenbach and Golenbach's University. We got Mark Littell and Mark Weiss. Mark in the midday. We got so many new shows, so many great people are coming to the network. We got Bill Kashanis in Philadelphia, and you can hear his podcast with Mike Schmidt and all the old Philadelphia ball players. Great shows, great times. I'm having a blast. You know, it's really doing a justice for those who don't know much about the history of baseball, and I think it's important. I think it's important for books like National Pastime and as well as the other authors and books that come on my show because it teaches us things that ESPN can't teach. Even Ken Burns' baseball is flawed in so many different ways. But when you read these books, and books are far from being outdated, you can go to the Kindle, these things are on, they're on the e-books, and they're on Kindles, and they're on Nooks, and they're on the iPads. It is so much more relevant to get a scholarly work. And even if you don't like to read full books, you can always browse through the book and pick out your favorite parts because the Internet and these tablets make you do so. And for the pure love of learning and learning about the sport, I cannot begin to tell you how much I learned about the sport in the last 8 years since tablets have come out. And because of it, I'm here today. And thank God, I've done my homework. And thank God we have a show like mine where we can sit and talk about old times and show how it affected the modern era. And, of course, we begin today, again, part two, I like to consider this. But Martin Babicz and Thomas Eiler, they're both teachers. Both of them are professors at the history of the University of Colorado Boulder for the Sewell Hall History and Cultural Residential Academic Program, the Communications and Society Residential Academic Program, and the History Department. And Mr. Babicz teaches several courses on American history, including America Through Baseball. And I saw a syllabus from 2016. I was browsing him on the Internet, and I saw him like, hey, this is great. And he is the author of a chapter exploring the historiography. I'm getting tongue-tied today. It's all the snow we had yesterday. Of sports and pastimes of the 1920s in a companion to Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And you know something, folks? The 20s were just an illusion. I'm a big FDR guy, so I won't criticize these three who came before FDR. But without any ado, welcome to the show, Marty.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad to be here today.
I'm glad you're on the show. Last time, you know, we went through the scandal. We went through the Black Sox scandal. We got to Kennesaw Mountain Landis and why he was elevated. We got to the end of World War I. Now we are going from the dead ball period to the live ball period. And what's going on in America around 1920 to 1929?
Well, there's a bunch of things going on, but the big thing is when historians look back at the 1920s, they see it as a transition, that it's the break from the old America and the beginning of a new America. And people at the time recognized it. They even referred to themselves as living in modern times. And they realized it was different than the Gilded Age. People were embracing the idea of evolution, the idea that history is moving in a single direction from the less complex to the more complex. We're getting new lifestyles. Women are getting new roles. They get the right to vote in 1920. We get the emergence of the flapper, these new brash women of the 1920s who are more assertive than their mothers or grandmothers were during the Gilded Age. We get automation in industry, and so we get this whole new idea that America is different, and so there's that outlook. And we see baseball being different because it's no longer being played under the strategy that people like Ty Cobb used, where you scratch out a run, you get on base, and then you bunt to advance the runner, or the runner steals the base, or you do a sacrifice. Instead, you get the emergence of Babe Ruth, who comes to bat and hits the long ball and knocks several runs in with one swing. A whole different strategy. In the 20s, we get this idea that we have scientific management where businesses are using science and experts and technology to be more efficient. We get that in baseball. Branch Rickey, the general manager of the St. Louis Cardinals, invents the farm system, a very efficient way to develop talent for his baseball team at a very low cost. And so we're getting baseball representing this new modern America of the 1920s. And, of course, the 1920s was a very prosperous period for the United States, and baseball is going to benefit from that. Baseball in the 1920s will draw about 9.6 million fans each year. And so people are going to ball games. Baseball is benefiting with that. But there are some people in the 1920s who don't like the changes. They don't like that America is becoming more urban. In fact, the 1920 census was the first census that had a majority of Americans living in cities and towns rather than on farms. They're afraid America's losing its small-town values. They're afraid that white Protestant males are losing their position in society because of the arrival of immigrants, many of who were Jewish or Catholic, because African Americans are more visible. And so we start to get some people in the 1920s trying to suppress these changes. We get states passing laws banning the teaching of evolution. And, of course, there's the famous Scopes trial in Tennessee over that issue. We get the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We see the same thing happening in baseball. We get the issue over whether Major League Baseball should play games on Sundays or not. And many people thought there was no problem with that, and a number of states had legalized it, but the last three states to do so, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, they're holding out. And we get the same split along religious lines that we had over evolution. Mainline Protestants are fine with Sunday baseball, just like they had accepted evolution. And Catholic priests are fine with Sunday baseball, just like they had accepted evolution. But it's the fundamentalist evangelical Protestants who opposed evolution who are absolutely opposed to baseball playing on Sunday. And so this battle plays out through the decade as well. So what's going on in America is happening in baseball during that same decade.
And, I like to equate the 1920s with, like, the 1990s and early 2000s, You have all these computers coming out in the 1990s and smartphones, and now we're in the digital age. Think of the 1920s. Radio comes out. That benefits the Midwest. The Eastern teams didn't take to it. They thought it would drive down revenue. But Charles Lindbergh, he's going to Amelia Earhart begins in the late 20s, early 30s. You got bigger battleships now. I know Billy Mitchell, he was trying to, sail the fleet, and he was court-martialed. You have a lot of technological things that are happening. Music is changing. The whole dynamics are changing. And now New York is not only the hub of economic prosperity and the stock market, but now you have 3 major league baseball teams. And let's talk about the early 20s on how McGraw, who was the king of New York for so many years, now gets overshadowed by Babe Ruth, who is now becoming a media sensation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about McGraw, people look back at the early 20s, and the Yankees play the Giants in 3 consecutive World Series, and everybody's saying, this is the beginning of the Yankees and their dynasty. But in 2 of those 3 World Series, the Giants actually won. And in 1924, the Yankees did not four-peat, but the Giants did. And they lost that year to the Senators. But, the Giants are being overshadowed, even though they had a great team in the first 4 years of that decade. But the Yankees had Babe Ruth, who was breaking all sorts of records with his home runs. I think he had 59 home runs in 1920 or 1921, and that was unheard of. And so Ruth and the Yankees are getting all the attention. And we talked about the Black Sox scandal last time I was on your show, and baseball set up the commissioner to try to win back fans, to try to restore faith in the honesty of the game. But it wasn't Landis who brought the fans back. It was Babe Ruth's home runs that made baseball the most popular sport of the 1920s.
And, it's interesting because, Babe Ruth is such a complex character when you think of it. He disobeyed Miller Huggins. Huggins tried to get him under control, and he knew his power. He knew he was a womanizer. He knew he could not get arrested because he was drinking and prohibition was on. He literally felt he was above the law. And whereas he did this, he led this kind of lifestyle, he loved children. And because I think, his image, and he was really the second player besides Ty Cobb to really show the heroics of baseball, and he was on Time magazine. He was everywhere, Ruth. He was a flawed character. And in those days, the press kept it, from people, all of Ruth's, flaws. And my question to you now is, with the Yankees and Babe Ruth and the long ball now being, and baseball going into areas it really hasn't gone before, do you think that the 1920s culture itself has the influence on this decade of baseball?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, about Babe Ruth and how the press only depicted the good side of him. They're not doing that with other people. Hollywood movie stars are being dragged through the mud. There's a silent film star, a comedian named Fatty Arbuckle, who's accused of rape and murder because an actress died at one of his parties in San Francisco. And the press is just blasting him. But they're not doing that with Babe Ruth. They're printing stories about him visiting sick kids in the hospital. And so the 1920s was really the first decade where Americans become obsessed with celebrities. And this is partly because we finally get Hollywood, and movies had been around for a couple of decades, but by the 1920s, we got the golden age of Hollywood. Theaters are in every town in the country. People are going to movies, and they're developing some type of fantasy that they know these movie stars because they're seeing them up close on the screen. They're reading all about their lives in newspapers and in gossip magazines. Like I said, they're hearing all about these scandals. They think they know these people. Of course, they really don't, but they think they do. And it's not just movie stars that the public becomes fascinated with, but they became fascinated with Charles Lindbergh and his solo flight across the Atlantic. And they're becoming fascinated with athletes, people like Jim Thorpe or Red Grange or boxers like Jack Dempsey. But baseball was the most popular sport of the decade, and nobody could touch Babe Ruth in terms of popularity. So the public is really obsessed with him, so much so that newspapers on their front page, afternoon papers, are printing a little box that says what Babe Ruth did today. And it'll tell you how many hits, how many home runs he had in that afternoon's game, so that you don't even have to open the paper and look to the sports section to find out. That's how much attention is given to him. And the closest thing I could think of to that, if we translate it to our modern times, is when, and I remember this happening twice. I remember this happening when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were chasing Roger Maris's record, and I remember it back before that, when there was somebody chasing the record of that Joe DiMaggio had, and of course this player, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was somebody on Milwaukee. This player wasn't even coming, never even came close. But every time the player came to bat, or every time Sosa or McGwire came to bat, television stations would interrupt their program and show that at bat live on TV, so you can see how this player's doing. Well, the newspaper equivalency in the 1920s was newspapers putting that little box on their front page saying what Babe Ruth did this afternoon.
It's amazing. It's also amazing because Fatty Arbuckle looked a lot like Babe Ruth. If you ever saw the films. His career was ruined, and it later came out that he was innocent. The girl admitted that he never raped him, but he was ruined in Hollywood just from this.
Yeah, it's like the O.J. Simpson trial. Not that I'm saying O.J. Simpson wasn't guilty, but the court found O.J. Simpson not guilty, but the public never believed that. Well, the first two Fatty Arbuckle trials ended in mistrials, and the third trial found him not guilty, but his career was over. People didn't believe the court, found the truth of the case, and so nobody's going to put him in movies. Nobody's going to go see his movies anymore. His career was over because of that. Like I said, the press didn't do that with Ruth. They hid all his flaws, and instead they're printing stories about him being a saint.
And also with Ruth, you got a guy coming along named Branch Rickey, and he says, look, we got to find some quality players. So I'm going to let you tell the story and how he changed baseball forever with the invention of the minor leagues, the amateur leagues, which cultivate these kind of guys.
Yeah, Branch Rickey is the general manager of the Cardinals, and it's really hard to believe this today, but the Cardinals were not the most popular team in St. Louis. The Browns were. And the Cardinals didn't have a lot of money, and in those days, there were plenty of minor league teams all over the country, many more than there are today, but they were just independent teams. And if any minor league team had a decent player, he would attract some attention, and major league teams would try to sign this player. And the Yankees had all the money, so they would swoop down and get this player first. And Branch Rickey is thinking, I can't compete with the Yankees. I'm not as rich as they are. My team can't do it. So he starts buying minor league teams. And by the end of by the middle of the 1930s, he owns like dozen minor league teams in all different classifications. The lowest classification in those days was Class D, and those were teams with the least talented players in the smallest cities and towns. And the classifications improved all the way up to something then called Double A, which had teams in what would be essentially almost major league size cities like Baltimore or Kansas City or Los Angeles. And they had the most talented minor league players. He starts buying teams in all these classifications. And his plan is to go across the country, sign anybody he can find that could even play baseball, assign him to one of these teams based on that player's talent level, and then with proper coaching, hopefully some of these players will improve, and he'll promote them up the system until they're ready to play Major League Baseball. And when they are, he could trade away his stars, because the stars are getting paid a lot of money, and they're older, and he could get some good money for these guys from other teams, because teams are always willing to pay for a well-known player, and bring in this new guy who few people have heard of, but who's just as good as the guy they're getting rid of. And so he could get this flow of players coming into St. Louis at a very, very low price, and constantly have players ready to replace aging stars, have players ready to replace players who he could sell to bring in other money, or if he's got duplicates, if he's got a couple of good first basemen in the minor leagues, he could trade one of those guys away as well and bring in money to St. Louis. And so by doing this, he's turning St. Louis into a contender. The Cardinals will become much more popular than the Browns, and the Cardinals will start to win. They will defeat the Yankees in the 1926 World Series. They will win a World Series in 1931, and in 1934 he's turned the Cardinals into one of the best teams in the National League, and he's done it at a very low cost because he's adopting that same philosophy that other businesses and other industries are doing, finding an efficient way, a more efficient way to produce your product. And for baseball, the product that fans are paying is to see these players, and he's found a more efficient way, a cheaper way to bring in talented players to the team. And eventually, of course, all the other major league teams imitate St. Louis's farm system, but he's the guy who does it first, and he's the guy who gets the jump on all the other major league teams.
Now, even with the technological breakthroughs in baseball, is on a new path, a golden path, I would say. Like you mentioned earlier, you have the traditionalists, you have the evangelists, you have the anti-sentiment, the Ku Klux Klan being one. The golden age of Hollywood influenced a lot. A lot of people don't know about D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, but right after that film, and it was panned in a lot of cities, right after that film, the KKK grew. And not only did it grow in their sentiment against Negroes and Black Americans, but now they're taking on a racial term and a religious term. So now you have the Anti-Foreign Acts, which forbids Asians to come into the country. You have now the March on Washington from the Ku Klux Klan. And you could see the banners, KKK, no kikes for Jews, no Catholics, no coons. You are really getting a racist overtone now as a backlash. And this is going to segue us into the Negro Leagues, because the Negro Leagues is one of my favorite topics. I have a whole site dedicated to it. And I'm going to let you begin about the origins of it, Plessy versus Ferguson. What's going on in the 1920s when it was officially, started as a league by Rube Foster?
Yeah, and actually, I think if we're going to put it in the historical context, we need to go back to Reconstruction, really, because after the Civil War, we get these constitutional amendments adopted that are meant not only to end slavery, but meant to bring civil rights to former slaves. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment said if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen, and that was necessary because the 1857 case of Dred Scott v. Sanford said that black people, even if they're not slaves, are not citizens. And so the 14th Amendment overturned that. And then the 15th Amendment said a state cannot deny a person the right to vote based on that person's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Okay, so we get this attempt to bring civil rights. And this is sort of working during Reconstruction, but in 1877, the Army's withdrawn from the South. And with that, white Southerners are able to find ways to reassert white supremacy in the South through things like poll taxes and literacy tests. They're stopping African Americans from voting. Through things like sharecropping, they're limiting African Americans to a inexpensive form of labor for their farms and their plantations. And through adopting Jim Crow laws that physically separate blacks and whites in public spaces, they're setting up second-class citizenship for African Americans. And the thing was, there was no segregation until the 1880s and 1890s. Before the Civil War, during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, in public spaces in the South, blacks and whites occupied the same spaces. But this is done in the 1880s and 1890s. Interestingly enough, in baseball, there had been a handful of black players who played professional baseball, including Moses Fleetwood Walker, who actually played in the major leagues in 1884, and other players who played in the high minor leagues, people like Frank Grant and George Stovey. Okay, so in the 1880s, as Jim Crow laws are being adopted in the South, black players are pushed out of white baseball, so that by the end of the decade, they're no longer playing in the major leagues or the minor leagues. The exact same time they're pushed out of public places in the rest of society. And so African Americans respond by creating their own institutions. They create black schools, black churches, black businesses, and they start to create black baseball teams. And in 1896, you mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson. In that Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court said it's constitutional to have segregation laws as long as the facilities are equal. You can be separate but equal, and of course, you're not, because it's never equal. If you got a community that builds a new school, who's going to go to the new school? The white kids. And the black kids will go to the old school where the boiler doesn't work, where the roof doesn't leak, the school that doesn't have all the up-to-date technology the new school does. If you have a railroad company that buys new passenger cars, who's going to ride in the new passenger cars? The white passengers. And the black passengers will ride in the old cars where the shock absorbers don't work, so the ride is bumpy, where the springs are sticking out of the seat cushions. And so we get this idea of separate but equal, but it's not really equal. And so what we start to get at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century is the emergence of a number of African American leaders who are trying to change society. In the 1890s, we got an educator named Booker T. Washington, and he announces that, okay, African Americans will accept segregation temporarily as long as white Americans will help us with educational programs, help us with social uplift, and help us with economic opportunity. And then once we've improved in these positions, then maybe we can talk about equality. That's called accommodationism. And a lot of African Americans saw that as a sellout because he's not addressing lynchings, he's not addressing racial violence, he's not addressing getting African Americans the right to vote. And so it seemed to be a policy that played into what many white Americans were looking for. And so in the early 20th century, we get another African American leader, a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois, and he, with some other African Americans and with some progressive whites, forms the NAACP, a group that wants immediate restoration of voting rights, a group that wants immediate ending segregation, and they're going to do things through the courts. And they're going to win a couple of cases. They're going to get the grandfather clauses thrown out. But going through the courts is a slow process. And so W.E.B. Du Bois' system is not going to be satisfying because it's taking a long time and things aren't improving very quickly. And then in the 19-teens, we get a third leader, Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican immigrant who says, look, we're never going to achieve equality in the United States. We need to set up a nation in Africa of black people, an independent country. And at that time, of course, Africa was totally under the control of European countries. The whole continent was made up of colonies. And Du Bois even seemed to agree with the Ku Klux Klan that integration will never work. Well, this guy is being criticized. I'm sorry, Du Bois. I meant Garvey is agreeing with the Ku Klux Klan, saying integration will never work. And this guy is criticized by people like Du Bois, who saw him as a demagogue. And then he gets arrested for mail fraud and gets sent to prison, and that sort of discredits his movement. So by the 1920s, none of these three African-American leaders are demonstrating much progress. So African Americans start to turn inward. They start to concentrate on their own culture. We get an African American film industry set up called making things called race films. And this is partly a reaction to what you said about The Birth of a Nation, this very racist film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. We get the emergence of jazz music, and we get a literary movement called the Harlem Renaissance, where African Americans, rather than imitate white art, are creating their own art. And it's during the same decade that a guy who owns an African American baseball team in Chicago, the Chicago American Giants, the man's name is Rube Foster, he starts a league made up of black teams, the Negro National League, which starts in 1920. And so the creation of this first Negro League is fitting in with everything else that's happening with African Americans during the early 20th century. And the time period, again, is fitting, perfectly with what's going on, just like the color barrier, which was set up in baseball in the late 1880s, is fitting with the adoption of Jim Crow laws. The creation of the Negro Leagues is fitting with this Harlem Renaissance and this emergence of jazz music, where African Americans are concentrating on their own culture and sort of shutting out the rest of what's going on because they're not allowed to be involved in it anyway.
And people don't realize how important the Negro Leagues were to all the African American businesses. I mean, it was a multi-million-dollar industry. I think you put it in your book. It was that important, just like church on Sunday.
Absolutely, and these teams were like the center of African American neighborhoods. The players on these teams were celebrities within their communities. The teams gave African Americans a sense of identity, a sense of unity. And like you said, these were multi-million-dollar businesses, and there were very few opportunities for an ambitious African American businessman to really operate a huge business. Yeah, you could run a restaurant or a grocery store, but these were much bigger, and because they're so expensive to run, you're only going to get certain people who are going to run these teams, and mostly it's going to be people involved in gambling or numbers running or bootlegging, because they have the money to own a baseball team when most African Americans don't, and they have a need to own a baseball team because they have an illegal income that they have to hide. They have to launder their money. And if you own a Negro League team, it's a cash business. You pad the attendance numbers. Nobody knows how many people have really gone to your game. And by padding the attendance, you could claim that money you made through running gambling operations or selling bootleg whiskey is really money that you're saying you made from selling tickets to your ball team. And so we're going to get people like Alessandro Pompey and Gus Greenlee, who was a bootlegger, and Abe Manley, who ran the gambling operations in Camden, New Jersey. We're going to get these guys to be the guys who own most of the Negro League teams, people like that.
And you know, one of the things that the Negro Leagues, I always say, without the Negro Leagues, the baseball today would not be baseball today because they were that important. I think for Manley, who was Abe Manley's, wife, she cultivated, the Eagles in Newark. And she was a pioneer, especially in an age where women were pretty much discriminated against. She was white. A lot of people don't know that. But she had an African-American father, and she did a lot for the Negro Leagues. She thought when integration would take place that Major League Baseball would buy the teams and they would integrate the two leagues together. That didn't happen. They only took bits and pieces, Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Satchel Paige, and that destroyed the African-American economy.
Yeah, and you've actually raised three huge points, and if you don't mind, I'd like to address each of them. You talked about the Negro Leagues doing a lot for baseball. That's true. I mean, we mentioned how with the 1920s and the Babe Ruth and the long ball, the strategy of the game changes, and so one of the things that disappears in the major leagues is the stolen base. It's still in the rules, but nobody's doing that. But in the Negro Leagues, players are still stealing bases, and when Negro League players arrive in the major leagues in the late 40s and 1950s, the stolen base is reintroduced as a strategy in baseball. But the Negro Leagues did more than just help baseball. One historian, a guy named Don Rogozin, in his book Invisible Men, are going to argue the Negro Leagues actually helped end segregation in all of society, because research has shown that when a Negro League team played a team of white players in an exhibition game, Negro League teams tended to win 60% of the time. And that is a blow for this idea of white supremacy, because obviously these black players are just as good as the white players, and maybe even some of these players are better. And not only does that make it possible, or I should say, not only does that mean the argument that black players aren't good enough for the major leagues, not only is that argument ruined with that case, but Rogozin is going to argue this is what's going to actually lead to the rest of the civil rights movement. So Negro Leagues, according to Rogozin, is going to be one of the things that helps dismantle the segregation in all of society. Now, you mentioned Effa Manley, and she's the only woman in the Baseball Hall of Fame. She would be the person, after she married her husband Abe Manley, she would be the person who would run the team. He was concentrating on his gambling operations. He owned the team, to launder money, but she really ran the team. She signed the players, she arranged the schedule, and she was involved in the civil rights movement. Like you said, everybody assumed she was black because she had a black stepfather. She was married to a black husband. She lived in a black neighborhood, but she was really white. But she was the treasurer of the New Jersey NAACP. She lobbied Congress to try to get Congress to pass an anti-lynching law. And she's really only one example. The Negro Leagues were much more advanced when it came to women than the major leagues were. She's not even the first Negro League owner who was a woman. There was a woman named Olivia Taylor whose husband owned the Indianapolis ABCs, and she would help run that. A woman named Clara Jones, whose husband Clem Jones ran the Boston ABCs, and a woman named Henriette Green, who took over the Baltimore Elite Giants in 1949 when her husband, the owner Vernon Green, died. So we've got women running Negro League teams long before Joan Payson was the owner of the Mets. And in the 1950s, we even get three black women who will play on Negro League teams. Tori Stone played for the Indianapolis Clowns and the Kansas City Monarchs. Mamie Johnson will play for the Indianapolis Clowns, and as a pitcher, she'll play 3 seasons, and her record will be 33 wins and 8 losses. And Connie Morgan will play for the Indianapolis Clowns in 1954. So women are making this advance, and part of that may be the fact that the Negro Leagues are losing popularity after Jackie Robinson joins the Major Leagues, so Negro League teams are looking for some kind of gimmick to attract attention, so we get women playing. But you also hit the nail on the head when you talked about how integration destroys the Negro Leagues. And it's a sad thing for ball players because the white teams seem to have had some kind of quota. Some white teams are not even signing black players. The Yankees don't sign Elston Howard until 1955. The Red Sox, the last major league team to integrate, don't sign Pumpsy Green until July of 1959. And teams that do sign black players are only signing 2 or 3. They're not signing a lot of them, so most Negro League players are being put out of work because Negro League fans are quickly switching their allegiance to a white team. If you're living in the New York area, maybe you used to go watch F.M. Manley's Newark Eagles play, but now that Jackie Robinson's on the Dodgers, you're going to go watch the Dodgers play, or you're going to go to Harlem to watch the Giants play because they have Monty Irvin, rather than go to Newark to watch the Newark Eagles play. And in 1949, F.M. Manley's going to move the Eagles to Houston so that they're far away from other major league teams. But even that's only going to work for a couple of years, and after 1950, the Eagles go out of business, which means not only are black ball players losing their jobs, but these black businessmen who own these, multi-million-dollar teams, their businesses are now worthless because nobody's going to go to watch a Negro League team when there's a major league team that you could go. So if you're an African-American fan in Missouri, maybe you would go to Kansas City to watch the Kansas City Monarchs, or maybe you would go to St. Louis to watch the St. Louis Stars. But now that Jackie Robinson is playing for the Dodgers, if Brooklyn comes to St. Louis to play the Cardinals, you're going to go to that game to see Jackie Robinson. And so we get the collapse of the Negro Leagues in the 1950s. The Negro National League goes out of business after 1948. The Negro American League will last until 1960, but they're no longer a team made up of quality ball players. I think the Kansas City Monarchs will last as an independent team to about 1965, and there were a few teams that would go on farther. Back in the 80s, I saw the Indianapolis Clowns play a game, but the team was integrated, and it wasn't at all an all-black team anymore, and I don't think that team lasted much longer either. So the good thing about Jackie Robinson is it helps bring integration not only to baseball but to all of American society. But there was a cost where players lost their jobs and where owners lost their businesses.
And you know what's interesting about the Negro Leagues? The Negro Leagues were so scattered amongst, the United States. They had a West Coast League to compete with the Pacific Coast League. You had the Oaks out there. You had Seattle, the Steel Trust. I think the Steelheads they were called. You had it in the South. You had it in the North. But regionally, wherever you played would be a distinct taste of the culture you are playing in. For example, in the South, you could get lynched for playing baseball. It's that hard. It's that hard society that these guys had to travel through. In the South, if you were unfortunate to play in the South, you got the backlash. In the North, you had to deal with broken down stadiums, except for a couple of teams like the Black Yankees and the Newark Eagles. I know Effa put $15,000 into a bus with air conditioning. You were writing in your book. I read that. But again, these guys are putting up with hard times. Let's discuss some of these hard times.
Yeah, and obviously it varied based on where you were playing at the time. If you're playing in a northern city, African-American players were celebrities, and so your team would stay in the best hotel in the black neighborhood of town, and these hotels were often just a notch below the best hotel in that city. And you know, the Chicago American Giants had a Pullman car that they traveled by, a very luxurious way to travel by train. And during the 20s and 30s, the railroads were the largest employers of black men. Black men worked as porters carrying luggage, and normally they're carrying luggage for wealthy white passengers. So when they get a Negro League team on the train, there's a bit of racial pride that they're carrying luggage for these black celebrities. So there's that in the North, but Negro League teams also barnstormed to bring in enough money, because you only play in a 60 to 80 game schedule. You're not bringing in enough money to sustain these teams, and Negro League players were pretty well paid. Satchel Paige in 1942 made $37,000 or $38,000, which was 4 times the salary of the average white major league player. And even the poorest Negro League team, the Birmingham Black Barons, paid their least talented players $60 a month, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's what workers in New Deal programs in the 1930s were making, $15 a week. So you can make a decent living, but if you're traveling, if you're barnstorming and playing in the South or playing in the hinterland, you no longer have these luxurious hotels to stay in. So maybe you're staying in a boarding house or a hotel in the South that's segregated, that only serves black customers, or maybe you're camping outside of the team bus at night, waiting, so that after the night's over, you get back on the bus and you drive on to the next game. And so it could be, the conditions varied by where you were, and in order to bring in this money, you're playing many more games than the major leaguers. You're often playing double headers, sometimes triple headers. Very rarely there's even a team that would play 4 games a day. You'd schedule a game and play it, then you'd get in the bus and go on and play another game and then another game, because you needed to bring in as many fans who are willing to pay so that you can pay these guys a decent salary. And then when winter came, you still played. You might leave the country and play in Mexico or Cuba or Venezuela, again, because they needed this source of income to sustain these teams.
And you know what's sad about, the Negro Leagues? People don't really remember them. And a clear case was in the 1990s when Frank Thomas was asked about, I think, who Papa Bell and all. He had no idea. All these guys who are making all these millions of dollars don't have an idea who Satchel Paige was, or Josh Gibson, or any of this. We know Jackie Robinson because he's always celebrated, or Larry Doby. We don't know. And a few years ago, PNC Park, I think, took out some of their statues of the Negro League players, because they had a whole museum at PNC Park, and I remember people were protesting. But we're going into an age now where it is so far, long gone, about 58 years. If you want to be technical, it's 70 years since Jackie broke the color barrier. The stories, and especially with Buck O'Neill, who died about 12 years ago, he kept the Negro Leagues alive. It's dying. It's dying, and that's why I have a whole site on Facebook where there are people who are descendants of these great players, and there are people who reported on it years ago who come every day, who take pictures out of their drawers and post it on my site. This is what my uncle did. This is what my grandfather did, and it keeps the spirit alive. And, your book does it does well justice to them in that chapter in your book.
Well, thank you, Ian. And it's not just Negro League players. Americans tend not to have much of an interest in the past. They tend to forget it. There's some African American players who don't remember the Negro Leagues, but there are white players who don't remember major leaguers from those times either. It's not necessarily a racial thing. It's just we tend not to care about our past or know about our past, and that's why people like me have jobs as historians trying to educate people about what it was like before you were born, or before your father or grandfather your grandfathers were born. And I think it's part of my mission in life to make people aware of this. And it is sad when you see an athlete who doesn't understand the history of his sport. But it's no different than people in other walks of life who don't know their history either.
It's amazing. It's because, I majored in history, and before I went to law school, I got my master's in history, and I got my master's in tax and accounting, and went a different route. But now that I'm in semi-retirement, most of what I do now is writing on history and law, in baseball, no less. And I'm having great joy, and what you do every day in Boulder is something that I would have dreamed about, say, 20 years ago. I think it's probably the most important things to teach about is history, because who the hell wants to learn about all these algebraic equations and all that stuff? Only a small percentage is going to use them. But when you know your heritage, when you know your history, when you know what went on before, you can understand why the times you are living in is the way that it is.
Exactly.
And you do a great job. Let me tell you, I love these chats. Some I didn't even get to the 1930s. Not that I figured I would.
Yeah, I told you had an ambitious schedule for today's program.
Yeah, but we get into such good discussions, which is important. I don't mind making this into a series like I've done with Gerald Podair's book, who just won the Sabre Seymour Medal on building of Dodger Stadium. I think it's that important that people have to, should go here, look at your book, hear the show, and understand, why these guys in the game are doing, making what they are now. We'll get into Marvin Miller in a couple more episodes, and we'll just take the course and run it decade through decade. As always, it's a pleasure having you on the show, sir. Hang on.
It's fun again, Ian. I enjoyed being on your program again.
Oh, it's great. I love this. And remember, folks, if you want to hear the first program, you go to YouTube, just type in Genesis with Ian Kahanowitz, Martin Babicz. It should come out January 17th, 2018. This should be published either this week or next week. We'll make another appointment for you sometime in April. We'll get you back. Hold the line. Folks, I had a great discussion today. You can see, you could feel the passion, from Marty's dissertation on Babe Ruth and the Negro Leagues and the whole 1920s. It's an amazing time period. It's something that all of us should look back and enjoy in awe, because I'll tell you, baseball really changed right after the dead ball era. The 1920s just pushed America forward into avenues which I don't even think it knew it was going into. And, of course, the Negro Leagues, the importance of the Negro Leagues, and how it benefited African Americans in their own society with business and culture. If you get a chance, go to Kansas City, go to Alabama, go to those museums. Both of them are something to see. You'll get a huge history lesson, and an important one, because it's that important. As always, I am Ian Kahanowitz, and I'm on behalf of Ralph Tycho and the network, and in the immortal words of my hero, Edwin R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.